is Dr. Gleb Sipurski. He's been on the show before, CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. Gleb is an internationally recognized thought leader with more than 20 years of experience consulting, coaching, speaking, and training, and more than 15 years in academia as a behavioral economist and cognitive neuroscientist. A best-selling author, he is best known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. Also, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. And also Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Okay, Gleb, it's all yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction, Dirk. And welcome, everyone. Let's talk about how you, as quality professionals, should gather high-quality data. Make sure that you make the best decisions possible using techniques informed by neuroscience. And we'll talk all about that. But first, as Dirk mentioned, let's talk about GIGO, this concept of garbage in, garbage out. This is a well-known concept, but I think it's one that people are really not using nearly as much as they should, because we still have a lot of garbage out decisions which indicate garbage in data. And this is a tendency on our part that comes just from how our brains work. We tend to be too confident about our decisions. We tend to be too confident about our data. Quality professionals just as much as everyone. So let's think about a couple of studies that come from behavioral economics, one of the fields in which I have expertise. There was a study done in 2002, which found that of all major construction projects, of course, in which a lot of quality professionals worked, 86% of them came over budget. 86% of these major construction projects came over budget. That's kind of sad, but it's indicative of the kind of data that was gathered and the kind of projections that were made on this data. Of course, if your construction project comes in over budget, it usually comes in way over budget. And unfortunately, a lot of these came in way, way over budget. So this is a big, big problem. And this is indicative that even though the phrase garbage in, garbage out is well known, it's not really well applied. Now, construction is not far from the only area where this applies. Think about IT projects. There was a study in 2014 which found that of all major IT projects, 84% of them came in over budget, 84%. And if they did come in over budget, the study specifically looked at how much. On average, they came in 189% over budget. So more than twice as much, nearly 3 times over budget. This is pretty sad. And again, this is something pretty frequent, pretty regular. This is how our brains work. So decision makers, including quality professionals and all sorts of decision makers, you tend to be, as quality professionals, decision makers in your own quality sphere, but also you tend to be trusted advisors to decision makers higher up or other sectors of the organization. And you need to be aware that you will make decisions badly when you go with your gut, and they will make decisions badly when they go with their gut. These are studies, but of course, there are many case studies, not simply research studies where this happened. I mean, just right now in the news is Boeing's approval of the 737 MAX to fly after nearly 20 months of being grounded, after 2 catastrophic air crashes, which killed 346 people terribly, horribly, and wiped about $25 billion off Boeing's market cap. And that was before the COVID pandemic. So that was before the COVID pandemic. And of course, when we later investigated what was going on with Boeing, there was really a lot of information within the company that the plane construction was not doing well, was not going well. There was an email saying that, hey, internal email within the company, which said that these planes are manufactured by monkeys, supervised by clowns. You never want to hear that said about an airplane or any product in your company. But that's what was said. But the Boeing leadership chose to not delay the process, chose to push through the certification, cut some corners. And unfortunately, what resulted was pretty bad, terrible for the world and Boeing alike. Now, that's one example out of the private sector. And of course, this applies to the public sector. Think about the CDC kerfluffle with testing, where they shipped out in February of this year. They decided instead of going with the WHO approved tests, they will create their own tests. And So they decided to do that. And then they shipped out these tests in early February for COVID. And what happened with these tests was that they were badly made, poor manufacturing, poor quality manufacturing, so serious quality issues in this manufacturing, and they weren't reliable. So therefore, for about a month until they shipped out new tests in March, we did not have good tests for COVID. And according to later investigations, this cost a lot of lives because it allowed COVID to spread unchecked throughout the United States. And that's one out of many reasons for why we have such problems with COVID right now, where just about over 250,000 people died in just recently, kind of the latest statistics. So pretty horrible numbers. And those are all quality failures because people didn't gather good information, and garbage in resulted in garbage out. So right now, I'd like you to take a look at the poll, and I want you to answer. In your workplace, how problematic is GIGO? How problematic is this tendency of garbage in, garbage out? So where not the best data is gathered, unfortunately, and that results in poor decisions. Is it a minor problem? Is it a moderate problem? Or is it a large problem in your workplace? All right. So I see that of the 89 people, we have about 65% of the people voting. So let's get a few more. You should be able to see the poll right there on your screen. So please go ahead and make your voice heard. I'll give you 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds. Three more seconds and finishing up. All right. So as you see, it's for 6% of you, it's not at all a problem or a minor problem. I'm glad for you. So that's great that your workplace doesn't suffer from that. Unfortunately, the vast majority of you, your workplaces do suffer from it. For about 2/3 of you, 68%, it's a moderate problem. And for about a quarter for you, it's a large problem. So I'm glad that you realize it. And this is something for you, both in your sphere of work as quality professionals and in your role as a trusted advisors to leaders in your organization, to bring this information to your leadership and help ensure that they make better decisions having this information. All right. Let's talk about why we make these bad decisions. You already got the hint that it's because of going with our gut. Unfortunately, going with our gut is what people tend to advise us to do. It's what gurus, business leaders of all sorts say, oh, you should go with your gut, follow your heart, trust your intuition. And that's what the large majority of leaders in your organizations do. Because trusting your gut, I mean, a number of quality professionals do it because they trust themselves, they trust their gut. It feels comfortable, it feels good. It's going with what I feel is right, and therefore this is right. So it's confusing the feeling of comfort with the feeling of truth, with actual truthfulness, with actual reality. It often leads to disasters, like the Boeing disaster, like the CDC disaster, like those 86% of construction projects that went over time and budget, and 84% of IT projects that went over budget. Because our gut, our intuition, our heart, our emotions, whatever you call it, it's not evolved for the modern world. It's actually evolved for the ancient savannah, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, when we were hunters, gatherers, and foragers. That's what our gut is evolved for. As a result of this, we make a series of dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. And that's what you have to learn about in order to avoid gathering poor data. It's very tempting for us to gather data that fits our intuitions, that fits what's comfortable for us, as opposed to the right things. And it just comes from how our brain is wired because of our evolutionary background. We have to understand this background in order to make better decisions. And I want to talk about, well, I'll talk about some specific examples of this. But before I talk about some specific examples of these dangerous judgment errors, I want to launch another poll. Was there a time when you were very confident that you were right about something as a quality professional in your sphere, and so professionally, and you turned out to be badly wrong, and it led you to doubt other areas where you might be wrong? I mean, I know it happened to me. I make these sorts of mistakes. I'm human, and that definitely happens to me. So I'm curious if that's something that happens to you in your professional sphere, where as a quality professional, hey, you thought you were confident that you're right, and you turned out to be badly wrong. All right, I see we have about 2/3 of the people voting, so 68%. Great, so let's give 10 more seconds for everyone to vote, make their voice heard. All right, I'm gonna end it now. Great, so we see that for just under 20% of you, this didn't happen. So I'm glad for you. So this is not something within your experience, but the large majority of you, 84% of you, that happened in your sphere of work as a quality professional, where you're very confident about something and you turned out to be badly wrong. And that's something that's a frequent part of our professional experience. I mean, if you haven't had that, that's great for you, but it also might be the stage of your professional experience where you're currently in, because we tend to have a lot of these problems where we get overconfident and have a lot of these problems. So let's take a look at some specific cognitive biases. Starting with the planning fallacy. This is one of 3 cognitive biases I'm going to share with you about so that you'll learn about the specific dangerous judgment errors. I need to learn about all of these cognitive biases. There are over 100 of them, but you don't need to learn about all 100 of them. You can take a look, if you're curious about all 100 of them, you can take a look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. So there's going to be a list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. There's over 100 of them. You're going to have an opportunity to get a resource from me with the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases that will help you make the best decisions in gathering information. So 30 most dangerous cognitive biases, you'll learn about them, and that will help you address them. And these are 3 of these cognitive biases, so you know what I'm talking about. One is the planning fallacy. Now, intuitively, it feels very good to us. It feels very comfortable for us. When we make a plan in our quality decision making, when we're launching a project, manufacturing, whatever we're doing, IT, whatever is within your expertise of quality professionals, you won't assume that the future will go according to plan. You've probably heard the phrase, failing to plan is planning to fail, right? Failing to plan is planning to fail. It's a very common phrase. It's, and people use it frequently. Unfortunately, when you look at the research behind this phrase, it's actually very misleading, because the assumption behind this phrase is if you make a plan, it will go well. So if you make a plan, it will go well. And that's not the reality of the situation. All of those 86% of the construction projects that went over time and over budget, they had a plan. So did the major IT projects, and didn't go according to plan. The reality is that the much better phrase, which I teach my clients and which I hope you'll use from now on, is failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. Again, failing to plan for problems is planning to fail. That's a much better phrase and a much more accurate one that will help you avoid making disastrous decisions. We underestimate the kind of problems and the risks that come because we don't want to think about them. It's very unpleasant. It feels very uncomfortable to think about them. So our mind steers us away from it. Our emotions, our intuitions, our gut reactions, they determine about 80 to 90% of our decision making when we just go ahead with our natural intuitive state of decision making. And so we underestimate these problems, these risks, and the resources we need to address them, like time and money for those construction projects and IT projects. And of course, other resources, information about what's going on in the future, social capital, networks of connection and support. Now, the CDC example was a perfect example of planning fallacy, where there was a little bit too much confidence in the CDC in rejecting the WHO, World Health Organization, approved test for COVID and trying to come up with their own and screwing up. It's well known that when you're doing a project for the first time, you're much more likely to screw up than when you're doing a project more than once, because you've learned some of the issues. So given that they didn't know how to make a COVID test, right, would have been wiser to use the WHO approved one and not go with one that they kind of created and thought that, hey, we'll be cool and create this new one. I mean, I don't want to kind of make fun of them, but really this is the kind of mindset when you look at the investigation of what was going on in the CDC, they kind of had too much confidence in themselves and they didn't consider all the various factors that might go wrong. And so that's an example of the planning fallacy playing out in reality. And I want to check with you, again, going back to the poll, How problematic is the planning fallacy in your organization? So think about your organization. How much overconfidence is there in the plans? How much underestimation of resources needed? Time, money, information, social capital, what other resources? Not preparing for problems and risks. How much is there of that in your organization? All right, I see about 59% of the people voted. Great. So I'll give about 10 more seconds for folks to vote. All right. Let's take a look at the results. So under 10% of you, just under 10% of you, it's not a problem. Great, I'm glad to hear it. So you don't have problems with plans going over time or over budget, excellent, or minor problem. For the rest of you, 91%, it's a moderate problem or a large problem. Just under 2/3 of you, 62%, see that as a moderate problem. I'm glad that you're aware of it, and that's something for you to be thinking about. How do you bring this information into your organization as you see it as a moderate problem? This is kind of something to do in the medium term of the next couple of weeks or so. As you think about it, sit down with the results from this presentation, some of the resources that I'm going to send afterward to folks who want it, and use that. Now, for pretty large chunk of you, just under a third, who see it as a large problem, that's much more of a short-term prospect. So as Dirk mentioned, this video will be available in about 24 hours. That would be a wise video for you to send to folks who you want in your organization to let them know, hey, this is something that I identified as a serious problem. This is something that maybe we should be looking at and addressing in the very short term. And of course, some of the resources that I will send afterwards as well. All right. Let's take a look at another important cognitive bias for you to understand, the confirmation bias. This has to do with how we confirm our beliefs. We feel comfortable with information that goes according to our beliefs. When we look for information, when we're making quality decisions or all sorts of decisions, we look for information that goes according to our beliefs. If we think something is good, we will tend to find information that is good. If we think something is bad, we will tend to find information that it's bad. And we don't try to disconfirm our beliefs. We don't try to look for information that goes against our intuitions, that goes against what we feel is right. It's very unintuitive to do that, right, by definition, because these things are uncomfortable to us. It's really uncomfortable to look for information that goes against our beliefs, against what we feel is right. And that is very not the natural way of things. We need to go against our intuitions, against what we feel is right, to use this approach. So we search for this data. There are two aspects of the confirmation bias. We search for data that confirms our pre-existing ideas, and when we learn about data that goes against our beliefs, we tend to ignore it. When we learn about data that goes against our beliefs, we tend to ignore it. This is a big problem. And going back to the start of the presentation, this is a major issue in Boeing. So what happened in Boeing? There was a lot of information that the top leadership had of cutting corners and too fast production on its new airplane, 737 MAX. There was a number of concerns brought to the attention of the top leadership of Boeing about the 737 MAX being, not as safe as its previous models, having a lot of issues with the email I quoted about, made by monkeys, supervised by clowns, and other sorts of emails like this. Information from plant managers saying that, hey, we're doing this too quickly. There are some issues with the systems we're installing. And then, of course, pressure by the Boeing on the FAA to approve it, cutting some corners, sweeping some bureaucratic stuff under the rug, thinking that, hey, we're fine, this is great, this is safe, and we don't need to worry about it. Partially because all of their previous models, all the previous newer models of Boeing that they put out, so each new model was safer than the last. So they just didn't have within their imagination, they couldn't imagine that this new model, the 737 MAX, could be less safe. It would be at least as safe as the previous one. So it's fine. And it's, of course, saves fuel, which is the big benefit of it. Let's produce it, not worry about it. That was the mindset in Boeing. And this mindset resulted in terrible, terrible loss of life for people. And of course, huge loss of money for the company. The CEO was fired, Dennis Muilenburg, plenty of other leaders were fired, as were, of course, a number of people who worked directly on the 737 MAX, including quality professionals. So this is something to really watch out for. You want to look for information that disconfirms your beliefs, goes against your intuitions, and kind of try to not look at information that confirms your beliefs in much harsher light than it is intuitive to us. And let's talk about what's going on in your company now. How problematic is the confirmation bias in your company? So please go ahead. Vote about how problematic is the confirmation bias in your company. Okay, about 50% of the people voted. Great, so we're up at 65%. I'll give you 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds to vote. All right, 3 more seconds, and I'll stop the poll. All right, so let's take a look at the results. So about just over 10% of you, the confirmation bias is not a problem. So your company is specifically looking for information that disconfirms its beliefs and not looking for information that confirms its beliefs. So I'm very glad for you. For the large majority of you, the confirmation bias is unfortunately a problem. For about 2/3 of you, it's a moderate problem. So again, as I talked about with the planning fallacy, what you want to be doing when it's a moderate problem is trying to take this information, thinking about it maybe within the next couple of weeks, and bringing it to your teams, to your leadership, and just, of course, looking for when you might be engaging in this problem. For about 25% of you, just under 25% of you a quarter, it's a large problem. So given that it's a large problem, you really want to emphasize bringing it within the next couple of days with using some of the resources that I'll email, the video that will be put up. So those are the things that you want to definitely bring to the attention of your leadership within the next couple of days, pretty quickly. And let's talk a little about the last cognitive bias that I want to share with you before moving on to a solution for a specific technique that would solve it. Of course, one of the techniques for solving these dangerous judgment errors, for avoiding falling into garbage in, garbage out, is to learn about them. This is the point of what we're doing here, right? Learning about the planning fallacy helps you avoid the planning fallacy. Learning about the confirmation bias helps you avoid the confirmation bias. So you want to learn about them, but then there is also a technique that you can apply that would address a whole bunch of them at once. And we'll talk about that technique closer to the end of the presentation. But before we get to that, let's talk about the last cognitive bias that's really important to be aware of. And this is the empathy gap. You know, empathy is not something we talk nearly enough about within the quality circles. Talking about empathy, planning, kind of looking for information, yes. But empathy, no, we don't talk about that. That's not a large topic of conversation, even though emotions, as I mentioned before, they determine about 80 to 90% of our decisions when we just go forward as we go with our gut intuitions. So we underestimate other people's emotions. This is the empathy gap. The empathy gap refers to us underestimating how other people feel. So other people's emotions, we really underestimate them. We assume that they tend to be rational decision makers. In the job, we talk about the head, not the heart. And this is not something that is great because we underestimate the extent to which people use their heart to make decisions as opposed to their head, unfortunately. Well, fortunately, unfortunately, this is just the human condition. So we fall into this empathy gap. And that's why we are surprised by other people, are shocked sometimes when we fail to predict what kind of decisions they make and what kind of behaviors they'll follow. So I was working on this strategic pivot with a company of consulting their strategic pivot. And we did a retreat where the leadership went into the retreat and then they hired me just to do the retreat, nothing else. So I facilitated the strategic retreat, we had a really good plan for pivoting the company in a number of ways. And then later, when I contacted the company in about 6 months, about what was going on with the strategic pivot. And this is, by the way, a manufacturing company. I should mention that, with a number of quality issues, with a number of quality professionals who are part of it, and including one who was at the strategic planning meeting. What I found out was that once they did the strategic planning, they tried to communicate it to the teams involved in all aspects of the company. They got a lot of resistance. They got a lot of pushback. And why was this? Well, because they communicated this plan as a fait accompli, as something that was done, as something that was decided, and as something that everyone had to follow. This is not good. I mean, I kind of wish they would have had me help them on the communication, because really the strategic pivot is only as good as you communicate it and as you implement it. And if you don't implement it and communicate about it effectively, you're really going to get in a lot of trouble. So the issue with that communication, with that engagement, is the same as with any change management project. When you think about change management as quality professionals, you're going to be involved in plenty of change management projects. The issue with change management projects, when you want to change the existing condition of how things work, is that people are people and they have feelings. They get anxious, they get scared, they lose control, they feel that their current world is being turned upside down. That's what change is about. When how much change has COVID brought? I mean, pretty terrible changes. And this is a change issue that's very anxious, anxiety-inducing, very scary, very uncomfortable when your company is doing a strategic pivot, or when you're going into any other change management activity. So when you're managing change, unfortunately, when quality professionals or other professionals who are I'm analytically oriented, kind of, head-oriented person, and I have had to learn, looking at the research on this topic, that I really need to focus on the heart as opposed to the head when I'm trying to manage change and institute change in an organization as a consultant. And of course, my own organization that I run, the Disaster Avoidance Experts that Dirk mentioned, consulting organization. Because change is primarily about emotions, about how people feel, not about how people think. So the first thing to do when you're communicating about a new initiative is to address feelings, how people will feel, make them safe, make them comfortable, address their loss of control, address their vulnerability, address their anxiety. This is critical. And this is something I really want to very highly emphasize for you as quality professionals. When you're communicating about a quality issue, when you're looking at a change issue, whenever you're communicating about these sorts of things, you want to focus, first of all, on how people feel, not how people think. When you're trying to get change done, focus on how people feel. That is fundamentally important. And now I will want to take a look at the poll, and you will want to take a look at the poll and vote on your workplace. How problematic is the empathy gap? Insufficient consideration of other people's emotions. How problematic is the empathy gap? So where other people's emotions are not considered enough when making decisions. So let's take a look at the voting. So we have just under 50%. Okay, we're up to 50% now. So great. We have 63%. I'll give 10 more seconds. So make sure that you get your voice heard.
And Gleb, while you're waiting for that, just let everybody remind everybody that if you have any questions for Gleb, you can just use the Q&A box down there towards the bottom of your screen. Just click that Q&A button and go ahead and send your questions. And when Gleb is done with his presentation, we'll get to them. Thanks, Gleb.
Excellent. Thanks, Dirk. All right. 3 more seconds and I will close down the poll. Okay. Well, this is an interesting split. So we have about 18% of the people for whom that's not a problem at all. Great, I'm glad to hear it. So it's not a problem, not an issue. That's wonderful. For about half of you, so it's looking at the previous results, this is it's a problem, serious problem for 82% of you, or moderate problem for 82% of you. So previously, the previous issues were more of a problem, but this tends to be a larger problem. So about half of you for whom it's a moderate problem. And again, you'll want to be thinking about the next couple of weeks, how to bring this information to your organization. But for about just under a third of you, it's a large problem. And this is the highest vote we had for the size of problems so far. So it sounds that for you, for the attendees, just about a third of you see it as a large problem. And that's something to really emphasize and kind of bring more quickly within the next couple of days to your organization's leadership, that this is a serious issue, which you want to make sure to deal with effectively. All right. So, as promised, let's talk a little bit about how to address these dangerous judgment errors. So overcoming these dangerous judgment errors has to do with learning about them and then learning about how they feel, how it thinks, and then addressing them effectively. And the first thing to do is the framework, understanding where it's come kind of a top-down approach, understanding that you should not go with your gut. You shouldn't trust your intuitions. It's very counterintuitive. It's hard to accept. I mean, it was hard for me to accept when I was learning it as a graduate student in my PhD program. This is very uncomfortable. Going against your intuitions by definition is uncomfortable. It's counterintuitive because our intuitions, they evolved to help early humans survive, and they're still very powerful. You know, the modern world has really been around since what, World War II, and we have not evolved for the modern world. Our intuitions are still there for that savanna environment. They're great for that time, you know, but in the modern world, they're very bad. Our brains are not wired to make good decisions in this modern world. So we have to use artificial approaches that are counterintuitive, that don't go with our intuitions. Now think about donuts. Think about that box of donuts, right? Think about, you know, entering a break room and there's a box of delicious chocolate glazed donuts right there. Now it's very tempting to perhaps take half a donut. And maybe after you take, you know, half a donut, you're like, okay, I'll take the remaining half. And then, you know, you take another donut and then maybe another donut. And then before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that I ever did it myself. Or perhaps, you know, your choice of poison is ice cream, right? Did you know that, you know, half a cup of ice cream is the standard serving size of ice cream? I don't know a person who can eat half a cup of ice. I certainly can't eat half a cup of ice cream. So our diet, why is that? Well, our diet, it's not adapted to the modern world. We are adapted to be triggered by sugar, like an ice cream or donuts or any other mass-processed food. That's what triggers us. In the savanna environment, when we came across a source of sugar like bananas, apples, honey, it was very important for us to eat as much of it as possible in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who survived, thrived, procreated, passed on their genes, and those who didn't. So we're right now very strongly triggered by sugar. You've probably adapted to this response, hopefully so. And you, instead of choosing to have those donuts, maybe you'll pass by and go for that bowl of fruit, a much healthier snack, much harder to overeat those, and it's going to be much better for you. And whatever your techniques of adapting to the sugar response, you figured out a diet that doesn't go along with your intuitions, because our intuitions are not well adapted for the modern world. So just as you've made healthier choices in your diet, you need to make healthier choices in your professional sphere and all other life spheres, to be honest. This is applicable to all life spheres. We're talking about professional life sphere today. So you want to make healthier choices, better choices, ones that don't go with your intuitions. And you want to teach others in your organization to do the same thing. And here's a technique that will help you to do that. It's called the failure proofing technique, and involves 8 steps that you can apply to any project, any process where, as a quality professional, you don't want to screw up. You want to make sure that this project, this process goes well. So make sure that you apply this technique to any project, any process where you don't want to make a bad decision and where you want to make good decisions in implementing them effectively or improving these projects and processes. So first step, you gather external stakeholders. You shouldn't have more than 10 people. 6 people is great. So you want to combine leaders with the most expertise, not just the highest not just the highest or up personnel, but leaders, people with leadership who have the most expertise on the topic. Of course, you want to include some people who have the power to make and implement decisions. And you strongly consider using an independent facilitator, someone who's not part of the original group, that someone from outside the group, maybe board of advisors, maybe someone from quality professional groups. So I speak to ASQ, Association for Society of Quality, American Society for Quality groups pretty frequently. And that's a great group where you can get an independent facilitator. You can get a coach, a consultant, someone like that. So use an independent facilitator for this technique. Then explain the process, so get everyone on the same page, explain how it works, and of course you'll learn about this technique. You want to describe all the steps. I'll send you a manual for those who want it with more information on this technique so that it goes through in depth, give some examples. But basically you want to explain the process. Then develop the next best alternative. At least two of them, at least two next best alternatives that to your original plan. So you're going in with an original idea. Okay, this is the project, this is the process, this is how we are going to do this. This is failure proofing, where you look at this plan and where you see, okay, how can I do it in an alternative manner? You want to have each participant of those 6 to 10 people write down one NBA, and of course it can be less than 6 people. You can do it as 2 people, as one person if you're the only one implementing it. But 6 to 10 people, I find you don't want to do more than 10 people. So have each person write down at least one next best alternative anonymously. This is really important. And this is especially important for the independent facilitator because you can guarantee anonymity that way. Of course, an independent facilitator who is familiar with this technique is going to be helpful for a large range of things, but the anonymity is really important because you want unpopular opinions voiced. You want that to be heard. You want people to be heard who have that idea that, hey, maybe we should do it a different way. Then the facilitator gathers and reads everyone's NDAs and then holds a vote to select the top 2 to facilitate the discussion. So you want to choose the top 2, which seem most reasonable. And then you want an anonymous vote at the end of the discussion on whether one of the NBAs is preferable to your original plan. So maybe you've decided, okay, this next best alternative is actually better than what we were thinking of originally. And of course, if you think that, hey, the original plan is good, you still can integrate elements from NBAs into the original plan. So that's the 3rd step. Next, brainstorm reasons for failure. This is the 4th step. This is especially important here. The independent facilitator, the anonymity is going to be especially important. Of course, you can do anonymity without an independent facilitator. So I've done this with Google Forms, for example, when we do, let's say, virtual failure proofing technique. Of course, you can do it in person before the pandemic, doing it mostly virtually right now. So using Google Forms is a good way of getting anonymity. So this step. Imagine that the decision, the project, the process, whatever you're looking at, completely failed, definitely failed. And you don't want to say, well, what kind of problems might it have? This is not the question. This is not how you want to frame it. You want to say that it definitely failed, absolutely failed, because otherwise the proponents of this decision, project, and process, they will still have an emotional hang-up. They will have an emotional hang-up. There'll be a part of them will tell them that, hey, it can't fail. There's not going to be any problems. They will not be able to participate effectively in failure proofing. Instead, what you want to say, it definitely failed. There's no question. Absolutely failed. Yes, definitely failed. Then the question here is why it failed. Brainstorm reasons for why it failed. This is what you have to do. Brainstorm the reasons for why it failed. You want each participant to write out at least 3 plausible reasons, 3 reasonable reasons, the 3 reasons that make sense for why it failed. And what you'll tend to see is that people with different sorts of expertise will talk about different things. I mean, I've seen people talk about things like, hey, this new product launch will fail because the production manager is at odds politically with the sales VP. And this is a classical example of why you want anonymity. This is so important because that's going to be pretty hard to say out loud in the group if the production manager and the sales VP are in the room. But if you have anonymity, that really helps you get these kind of unpopular, politically challenging issues out. So the facilitator would gather everyone's statements, highlight key themes. You don't need to read everything, but highlight the key themes and focus on the responses again that would be not typically brought up, again, while ensuring anonymity, like that example that I gave with the political conflict. Then you want to decide on those most likely problems. So this is the 5th step. So the 4th step, brainstorm reasons for failure, and then decide which of them are actually most likely, especially those that I talked about were rude, politically problematic, dangerous to careers, the career limiting moves, right? Where saying it out loud would be a career limiting move. Check for potential cognitive biases. So we talked about some cognitive biases, and you'll get a resource for addressing a number of cognitive biases that you'll learn about, those 30 most dangerous ones. Assess anonymously. So again, anonymously, the probability for each reason of failure. You want anonymity here because people give different answers using percentages. It's the product launch is 60% likely to fail because of this conflict between the production manager and the sales VP. And you want to pay special attention to the ones that are most harmful, the ones that are most impactful. How likely is it, how impactful is this conflict between the production manager and the sales VP for the product launch issue? That it might be a big impact, it might be, well, for the product launch, it's likely to be a big impact, but it depends on the kind of issue that you're facing. And then this is the payoff. This is the sixth step. Brainstorm ways of fixing the problems. What failures are the most relevant based on the previous step, which is likelihood and impact. It's a combination of likelihood and impact. And then brainstorm ways of solving them. So here you're getting the payoff to a somewhat difficult conversation about all the problems and reasons for failure. The assessment and dangerous judgment errors in the workplace is about these cognitive biases, and that I'll send you at the end of the presentation for those folks who want. So you want to make sure to address these cognitive biases using that assessment. And then you want to do the same things for success. This is the seventh step, and it repeats the same thing for success. You want to imagine that this decision project process succeeded spectacularly, wonderfully, whatever you're doing, this construction project, this major IT project, the strategic pivot, change implementation project, whatever it is. It succeeded spectacularly. Why did it succeed? What are all the reasons for success? Brainstorm all the ways of achieving this outcome. So again, 3 plausible reasons for success, at least 3 plausible reasons for each participant. The facilitator gathers them, highlights key themes, and leads a discussion about them, checking for cognitive biases. And then you brainstorm ways of maximizing, bringing about each reason for success. And then, of course, you want to revise your plan. So revise your overall plan. Now you've learned about next best alternatives. You've learned about failures and addressing them. You've learned about success and maximizing them. Revise your overall plan based on this strategic exercise. Now, if you have a pretty serious revision, especially if you need to go back to the drawing board or decide, well, you need to get, let's say, with that product launch, you decide you need to go back and do some more of a market research because it's going to be kind of issue whether the market is really ready for this product, for example. Or maybe you want to address some of the tensions between the production and the sales. Then after you address these issues, you'll want to go back and repeat the exercise. So this is the 8 steps of the failure proofing technique that will really help you avoid GIGO, avoid garbage in, garbage out, and all sorts of problems. All right, I want you to vote now on how helpful might it be for some or all on your team to use the failure proofing technique to prevent failures in gathering information, quality information for decision making. So please go ahead and vote. This technique, how helpful might it be for you if folks were using it? So please go ahead, vote. We have about 1/3 of the people voting, so I'll give you still 15 more seconds. Okay, we have about 63%. So 5 more seconds left. Please make your voice heard. Three more seconds. All right, well, it seems that this would be pretty spectacularly helpful. So just 1% of you found it to be not helpful. Great, so don't worry about it. For moderately helpful, 1/3 of you found it, just under 1/3 of you found it moderately helpful. So then that's kind of the same thing to think about. Well, applying it to your own, what I would advise you to do is applying it within your own team within the next couple of weeks and saying, hey, bring it to folks in your team, try to have them use it, see how useful it would be. And you'll get a manual for this if you want to, so you'll get ready for that. And 2/3 of you would find it very helpful. I'm delighted to hear that. So that will be a good new tool in your arsenal. So you'll get a manual, you'll have an opportunity to vote to get it in just a bit using the same poll. And then you definitely you want to look for the manual. It'll give you a number of examples. I went through it because of limited time. I didn't give too many examples, but that has a number of case studies as well as citations, references of how to use it effectively. And then you want to try using it on your own projects, applying it to past projects if you don't have any immediate ones, and seeing what kind of problems could you have caught. And then, of course, future projects. That's kind of the payoff for future projects, right? That's when you want to be focusing on it. Great. All right. And now, as promised, here are the resources that you can get if you want them to receive them. First, a free coaching session with me, if you want it, on integrating this information into your workplace. So free coaching session with me. Then the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, which I mentioned has the 30 most dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases that you need to learn about. They'll help you see where they are in your workplace and address them effectively. Then a manual on failure proofing. So the technique that we just went through that pretty much all except 1% of you, so 99% of you would find moderately helpful or very helpful. And then a digital copy of my best-selling book on this topic, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. All right, let's go back to the polling. And here, please vote on whether you would like to receive these resources. So would you like to register for these resources? So please go ahead and vote whether you would like to receive all of these resources: the coaching session, the assessment, the manual, and a copy of the best-selling book.
And just a reminder to everybody that we'll be getting to the Q&A here pretty soon. Some of you have started submitting questions, so thank you very much. And we'll get those questions to Gleb here in just a bit when we start. Thanks, Gleb.
Excellent. Thank you, Dirk. All right, so we have about 64% of the people voting. Great. So let's give folks about 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds to vote whether you would like to receive the resources or not. Three more seconds, and I'm going to close it out. Okay, great. So about 3/4 of you would like to receive the resources. That's wonderful. So Dirk will then send me the names and emails of the folks who said that they will want to receive the resources, and I'll email you the resources after the webinar. So pretty shortly afterwards, I presume within the next day, probably by the time the video is available. Great. And as we get to the Q&A, we have to remember that this webinar was sponsored by Intelex, a great organization that has a lot of very useful resources for quality professionals. So I would like to ask you if you would like an Intelex representative to send more information on its solutions, the way it can help you make the best quality decisions. So various technological solutions. So I'm going to launch a poll now. This is not for my resources. This is for Intelex resources, the folks who sponsored this webinar. So thanks to them. And after this voting, we will get to the Q&A.
Thanks, Gleb. Yeah, well, we're giving people a little bit of a chance there. You know, I was kind of struck. Maybe not so much the planning fallacy, but you know, the cognitive bias and the empathy gap. You know, as you're talking about them, I'm just kind of going, you know, this is kind of common sense. I mean, we kind of innately know that, yeah, I favor opinions that align with mine, and I really don't pay any attention to those guys who I disagree with. I mean, but when you put it out there, it really stops and makes you stop and think about it a little bit. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And this is kind of what we tend to find, that folks, they know that they tend to fall into these, but they don't do anything to address them. They don't feel that these are dangerous that these are dangerous problems. And you know, that's why we have 86% of construction projects going over budget. That's why we have 84% of IT projects going over budget. That's why we have Boeing, the CDC, the company with a strategic pivot that I mentioned. This is the problems that tend to happen. All right, I'm going to finish this polling, and let's see if there are any more questions besides the.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, we got some interesting ones coming in here. You have spoken about unintentional behaviors. What about willful blindness, where people have the ability to do something, but deliberately choose not to take any action? Are there ways to minimize this effect?
Absolutely. So first of all, when you're seeing willful blindness on the parts of others, that's probably not what's going on within them. It might be, but it might not be. And you don't know whether it's willful blindness or whether folks are just missing the information or they're falling into the confirmation bias. I mean, the confirmation bias is something that happens to all of us, including management, perhaps management more often than most. But this is something that happens to all of us. This is a very common tendency for us to fall into this cognitive bias. The confirmation bias and the related bias is the empathy gap. I mean, when you, just for a side digression, when you look at the empathy gap, you'll tend to see that the higher up you go in the organization, the more of an empathy gap there will be. So leaders, the higher up you go, they tend to ignore other people's emotions more. That's just what the research suggests. So they have more of an empathy gap than others. So management tends to fall often into these sorts of cognitive biases. They're taught that their decisions should go with their gut. These gurus who are speaking to them, all of these sorts of Tony Robbins and all of these sorts of folks who's, or Malcolm Gladwell, who's like, blink and make your decision, right? Not good advice, not the way you actually want to be making decisions. So you don't want to necessarily suspect that they're maliciously, deliberately making bad decisions. A lot of it will come from their ignorance of the situation, from not knowing that they fall into these dangerous judgment errors and trusting their gut. They're feeling that something is right, and they're ignoring information that they feel is not right. So you need to teach them that their feelings are not necessarily indicative of what is true, of what is real. And that is something that is very important to help convey, that, hey, our feelings are not necessarily indicative of reality. Truth is different than what's comfortable to us. So that's the first step I would take with folks and make sure that you address that. And I've seen when I do consulting projects on this for companies and do the trainings, communicating this information, a lot of problems tend to disappear once this information is communicated effectively. Second, sometimes, of course, it is going to be malicious. Of course, people protect their territory. They want to make sure that their budgets are bigger than other people's budgets, compensating for their own inadequacies or something like that. That's where it really helps to institute techniques like failure proofing and other techniques described in my book, Never Go With Your Gut, which you'll get a copy of if you're registered for it. So there are a number of techniques there that, if you institute them as part of the standard operating procedures, so the SOP of a company, then you'll get a lot of benefits, because that kind of forces managers to address a lot of the cognitive biases and problems. It reveals a lot of the problems that happen, and so it addresses them automatically by forcing people to go for the technique. So that's the two things that I would encourage you to do.
Okay. That's interesting. What is your opinion on personality testing in order for everyone on the team to understand how to provide the correct empathy for that type of personality?
It's a good question. There are a number of personality tests that are not as effective as they're made out to be. So I'm pretty cautious about using ones that are not very well done, basically. The best of the major personality tests is the Big Five. So that's kind of when I do personality testing, which sometimes that's some things I do. I only look at personality tests that have come out of high quality research, because if you do a lot of the others that have not come out of high quality research, they tend to shift and vary and not actually get at what they claim to get at. So that's my approach to personality testing. You want to make sure that they're high quality researched personality tests. Then once you use those, that's definitely helpful for helping people in the team understand that, hey, other people are different. Some people are less empathy oriented, some people are more task oriented, some people are more people oriented. The extroversion, introversion aspect of things is actually something real that does get at a way that we think and feel. So other things from the Big Five get at ideas like someone who is very inquisitive and curious about the world versus someone who's withdrawn, someone who's cautious. So there are definitely things that you want to learn about people on your team. When you look at the research on the kind of teams that are best, it's going to be people with diverse personality styles. Now, they're also going to create more conflict. So you need to learn how to address and manage people with different personality styles different from yours. But those teams that do succeed in making the best decisions, gathering the best information, having the highest productivity, are those with people with different personalities who have learned to manage their differences effectively because they know about these differences.
So throughout your talk here, the context, at least to me, has kind of been teams. And somebody had a good question here. How about, what if you're a team of one?
Oh, these are absolutely, yeah, these are absolutely accessible. I mean, these are absolutely applicable to a team of one. When you're an individual, I mean, let's say you're planning your career, or you're a team of one with the only quality professional in your organization, you definitely are going to be able to influence others to avoid the planning fallacy, to avoid the confirmation bias, to avoid the empathy gap. And when you're making decisions for yourself, let's say, I mean, if you are a consultant, just a team of one in that sense, which I used to be before launching my own company, then you definitely want to be thinking about your own projects from that perspective. Apply failure proofing to your projects. See if you're falling into the planning fallacy, see if you're falling into the empathy gap when you're thinking about your clients, folks you work with, and the confirmation bias. They're definitely applicable to individuals as well as teams. Of course, I'm focusing on teams because quality professionals generally tend to work within a team of other quality professionals or on a team with other folks who are not quality professionals.
Let's see, got a couple. Okay. Decisions many times are based on productivity targets. So in an industry environment where zero risk is not in place, managers decide to take risk, but failed in assessing the risk of going with cheaper or quicker solutions. In general, they denied the potential risk. Why is that?
Well, for the same thing that planning fallacies, is a problem. This is just a tendency of ours. We tend to be very optimistic as human beings, especially people in leadership positions. When you look at leadership research, you will tend to see that leaders tend to be more optimistic than most. Now, why is that? Well, because people want to, going back to that savannah environment, the leaders were those who inspired others, who conveyed charisma, who conveyed power. And that, of course, inspiration comes with optimism. They project a bright future. The future might not be as bright as they projected, but this leads people to perceive them as leaders, and this leads them to be promoted up the chains of command. So what is very important for leaders, again, is to learn that their optimism is often misplaced. Their optimism is often going to lead them into the wrong directions. So the studies on the construction projects, the studies on major IT projects, all sorts of studies on all sorts of major projects and smaller ones show that we as human beings tend to be way too overconfident, way too optimistic. The confirmation bias and the planning fallacy are two kinds of ways we fall into this risk, into underestimating risks. And as quality professionals, it's going to be very important for you to help managers understand that, hey, we as human beings tend to underestimate risk. This is just natural, normal, and intuitive to us. But if we underestimate risks, these are the kinds of consequences that we fall into. And I, as a quality professional, can help you look ahead and address these risks that are coming your way because of how our brain is structured. You don't want to say something like, well, I'm a quality professional and therefore I'm cool and therefore you're stupid. That is not an attitude that is good. Unfortunately, it's an attitude I've seen a number of quality professionals take too often toward managers, to be kind of that supercilious attitude. Oh, it's kind of like, I am great and you manager don't know what you're talking about. It's much more effective to have an approach of saying that we're all flawed. This is just our brains. This is who we are. As human beings, we all tend to be over-optimistic. We all tend to be too oriented toward risks, toward planning fallacy, and all of these other problems. And we need to learn about them. As a quality professional, I'm just as flawed as you are, but I have learned about these techniques and I have learned that I'm flawed. So I can take steps to address these flaws and I can help you take steps to address the flaws that are present in all of us. So having this humble perspective, humble approach, I found is quite effective toward managers, especially if it's combined with training on cognitive biases. So sending folks this video, the video of this presentation and the resources that are going to be available to those who registered for them is going to be a good way of helping them learn about these cognitive biases that are problems for all of us.
Okay. Well, we've reached the end of our time here. There were a couple more questions. If we didn't get to your questions, don't worry about it. I will forward the questions that we didn't answer here, that Gleb didn't answer here. I will forward those on to Gleb, and he can get back to you. He can get back to you offline. I have your emails associated with those questions, so that's easy to do. One quick question I should put out there because this is kind of important. Regarding your resource list, they wanted to know if there was a fee for those resources.
Oh gosh, no.
That's what I thought. It was free. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, Gleb, thanks. Really interesting. Always really interesting listening to you talk. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Dirk. Really appreciate you inviting me, and thank you to Intellex for sponsoring it.
Absolutely, and thanks to all of our attendees, of course. As Gleb has said, and I have said, you will be receiving an email in about 24 hours with a link to a recording of this webinar, as well as a PDF of the slides. That'll be coming from Quality Digest, so keep your eyes open for those emails. You'll probably be getting some emails from, I imagine, from Gleb as well, particularly if you signed up for resources. So that is it. Well, so thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks from Quality Digest and Intellex. You have a great day, and we will see you at the next webinar. So long.
Bye, everyone.
And you can just go ahead and end that, Gleb. That would be